When the Council killed a human girl, Earth didn't just avenge. It erased them. They took her in the middle of a session. I was sitting 4 rows behind her when it happened. Lena had just handed her inquiry tablet to the floor clerk, calm as anything, her dark hair pulled back, her fingers steady. She had been working on that document for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of cross-referencing archive logs, comparing Veth Dominion timestamps against Earth's original sovereign status applications, tracing how a species with 17 seats on the Galactic Council had quietly buried humanity's advancement petitions across 4 decades. She had found the buried records. She had formatted everything correctly, cited every source, followed every procedural rule the Council required. She was 19 years old. She was the first human being ever born on Concord Prime, and she believed, with every cell in her body, that the system worked if you worked it right. I watched the floor clerk take the tablet. I watched him read the first 3 lines. I watched the color shift in his secondary eyes, that pale amber that Velhari species showed when they were suddenly very uncomfortable. He pressed a button beneath the desk that I had never seen pressed before. I had been on Concord Prime for 11 years. I did not know what that button did. I found out in under 2 minutes. 4 Veth security officers entered through the side corridor, not the public entrance, the service corridor. That matters because it meant the call had gone to a private channel, not through the Council's standard alert system. Someone had been watching for this. Someone had known she was going to submit that document, and had already prepared a response. They surrounded her before she could stand. I was on my feet instantly. Half the chamber was. But you have to understand what Concord Prime was in those days. It was not a human space. It was a space where humans were permitted to exist, conditionally, with careful behavior and measured speech, always aware that our species held the lowest tier of Council recognition, what they called provisional membership. We were guests. We were reminded of this often, sometimes gently, sometimes not. We did not have legal standing to intervene in a security action. We did not have the right to demand hearings. We had what they had given us, and they had given us very little. Lena looked back at me over her shoulder as they moved her toward the door. She was not crying. She looked surprised, which was almost worse. She had genuinely not expected this. She had thought the document would protect her. She had thought the truth was a shield. They called a tribunal within the hour. I was not permitted inside, no human was. The charge they filed was something their legal code called procedural endangerment, which from what I could translate meant she had accessed records above her clearance level. The fact that those records were supposed to be public, that they had been quietly reclassified at some point in the last decade without formal notice, was not considered relevant. The Veth ambassador, a tall, dry-voiced creature named Soveth Dar, stood before the Council chamber's secondary panel and spoke for 11 minutes. I know because I stood outside the sealed doors and counted every second. I had a small earpiece linked to a colleague of mine, a fellow human diplomat named Owen Garner, who was watching a secondary feed from the press gallery. Owen had been on Concord Prime even longer than I had. He had more gray in his hair than dark by that point, and he had a way of speaking that was always quiet, as though he was conserving something. He spoke into the earpiece in a flat, low voice and told me what was happening inside. He told me the tribunal lasted 14 minutes total. He told me the ruling took less than a minute to read. He told me they called it an enforcement action, not an execution. In Veth legal language, the distinction had something to do with the absence of formal criminal status. She had not been charged with a crime. She had been classified as a procedural hazard. That classification, under old Council law that predated human membership by 200 years, allowed for permanent removal. There was a viewport along the corridor where I stood, a long, narrow window that looked out over the lower processing bay of Concord Prime, where transport vessels docked and cargo was sorted, and the ordinary business of 1,000 species moved in quiet, endless routine. I stood at that window because I could not stand at the doors anymore. Because if I stood at those doors a moment longer, I was going to do something that would end my career and accomplish nothing. I was looking out at a supply freighter from the Marin Collective, slowly rotating into a docking clamp when Owen went quiet in my ear. Then he said very softly, "Marcus, it is done. My name is Marcus Hale. I have been a diplomat for the United Earth Council for 22 years. I have negotiated trade treaties, resolved border disputes, mediated cultural misunderstandings that could have collapsed into open conflict. I have shaken hands, or the alien equivalent, with 43 species. I have learned 9 languages and passable fragments of 6 more. I have dedicated my life to the belief that peace is built slowly, word by careful word, and that patience is the highest form of strength. I stood at that viewport and I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. The stars beyond were the same stars they had always been. The freighter finished docking. A small cargo loader trundled across the bay below, completely indifferent. I thought about Lena at age 7, visiting me on Concorde Prime for the first time, pressing her face against this exact type of viewport, and asking me to name every ship she could see. I thought about how she had memorized their names within an hour. I thought about how she had grown up wanting to be a bridge between species, wanting to be the kind of person who made the galaxy smaller in the best possible way. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my personal communicator. Not the diplomatic channel. My private line, quantum encrypted, registered to nothing official. I opened a message to a single contact listed only as Home Office, a designation that meant something very specific to a very small number of people. I typed one word, identits. Then I put the communicator back in my pocket and stood very still, and waited, and did not cry, because there would be time for that later, and because right now I needed every part of my mind to be completely clear. Owen came out of the press gallery door at the end of the corridor. He walked toward me slowly. His face looked like a man who had just watched something he could not unwatch. He stopped a few feet away and looked at me for a long moment. "The council has reconvened," he said. "Suvith Dar is requesting a formal statement from the human delegation." "Tell them we have nothing to say," I said. Owen looked at me carefully. "Marcus, that is going to read as an escalation." "Good," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, and turned around and went back the way he had come. I turned back to the viewport. The freighter had fully docked now. Its cargo doors were opening. Ordinary things were happening in an ordinary bay on a station where, 14 minutes ago, a 19-year-old girl had been taken from the world for asking a question. Somewhere between the stars and the cold glass and the quiet hum of the station's atmosphere processors, I made a decision. Not an emotional one, not a reactive one. The kind of decision that settles into your chest like something heavy and permanent. The kind that does not shake or shift regardless of what comes next. Whatever happened now, the Galactic Council had just made the last mistake it would ever make at humanity's expense. The stars outside looked exactly the same as they always had. That was fine. They would not look the same for long. The silence from Earth was the first thing that frightened them. Not immediately. In the first days after Lena's death, the Council did what institutions always do when they have done something wrong and do not wish to acknowledge it. They generated paperwork. Suvith Dar filed a 7-page procedural summary classifying the incident as a closed matter. The Council's administrative body issued a notification to the human delegation in polite, carefully bureaucratic language, the kind of language designed to convey finality without ever using the word apology. 3 species, the Vilhari, the Marin, and the quiet, slow-moving Dren, submitted what the Council called observational concerns, which was their version of a raised eyebrow. Not a protest, not a formal objection. Just a notation in the record that they had noticed something had happened. No one voted, no one called for a review. The 15 remaining council species simply moved on to the next session agenda item, which was a trade dispute over mineral rights near the outer Kelon system. Business as usual. I sat in the back of that session and I listened and I said nothing. Owen sat beside me. Neither of us spoke for the full 3 hours of the session. When it ended and the chamber cleared, the Veth ambassador paused near the exit and looked at me with that specific expression his species used when they were communicating what they believed to be a settled matter. He did not speak. He simply looked and then moved on. I have thought about that look many times since. That casual, certain confidence. The expression of a species that had operated at the top of the council hierarchy. For so long that consequence had become something that happened to others. That was day 2. On day 4, Earth recalled its full diplomatic delegation. Not just me, everyone. Every human diplomat, attaché, cultural liaison, medical officer, and administrative assistant stationed on Concorde Prime received the same message simultaneously, on the same quiet official channel, in plain language. Return home, effective immediately. No explanation was attached, no statement was issued, no press release was prepared. The human delegation office on Concorde Prime simply went dark, its doors locked, its communication lines forwarded to an automated holding message, and then the people inside it boarded a transport and left. I was the last to board. Owen was already strapped in when I came up the ramp. He handed me a container of cold coffee without saying anything. I sat down and drank it and watched Concorde Prime grow smaller in the rear viewport as we pulled away. "They will call it a tantrum," Owen said eventually. "Let them," I said. "They will say we are too emotional, that this proves their point about human instability. Let them say it." He turned and looked at me. "You know something," he said. It was not a question. I looked at him for a moment. Owen Garner was 54 years old. He had spent 30 of those years in deep space diplomacy. He had a daughter back in Bristol who sent him drawings of horses. He was one of the most methodically honest people I had ever known, and he had watched Lena die over a press gallery feed. And I could see in the lines of his face that he was holding something very tightly together. "I sent a message," I said. "One word." He waited. "They will know what it means," I said. He looked at me for a long time. Then he turned back toward the viewport and was quiet for the rest of the journey. The council noticed the silence within a week, not because they were perceptive, but because human silence had a texture they were not used to. For 40 years, humanity had been loudly present in every council forum. We attended every session, submitted every form, followed every rule, appealed every unfair decision through the correct channels, and failed gracefully every time, and tried again. We were in the condescending vocabulary of a dozen species earnest. We tried very hard. We cared very visibly. Several council species had made something of a cultural joke of it. The eager humans, always raising their hands, always filing their motions, always believing that this time the system would work. And then suddenly we stopped. No raised hands, no filed motions. No trade signals, no diplomatic communications, no responses to routine council queries about human-administered systems. Earth's communication arrays, which had been broadcasting on a dozen council standard frequencies without interruption for 4 decades, went completely silent. Not jammed, not damaged, simply. The Velhari ambassador, whose name was Thessa Oren, and who had privately been one of the more reasonable presences on the council, filed a formal inquiry to the Human Delegation Office on Earth 14 days after our return. The inquiry asked, in careful diplomatic language, whether the human delegation intended to maintain its provisional membership status. Earth did not respond. The Marin sent a similar inquiry a week later, phrased more personally, referencing long-standing trade relationships and shared research projects. Several joint scientific initiatives between Marin researchers and human universities had simply paused, their human participants having received quiet instructions to suspend all interspecies collaborative work. The Marin inquiry noted this with evident confusion. Earth did not respond to that one either. Sovith Dar, to his credit or possibly his miscalculation, publicly characterized humanity's silence as evidence of exactly what he had always argued, that humans were too unstable, too reactive, too governed by raw feeling to function as responsible council members. He gave a speech in open session calling our withdrawal a predictable emotional response and suggested the council take this opportunity to formally review the terms of human membership. 3 species voted to open that review, 4 abstained, 8 voted against it, which surprised people and surprised Sovith Dar most of all. I was not there to see it, but Owen had contacts still monitoring the council feeds, and he told me about it over a call one evening. We were both back on Earth by then. Owen was in Bristol with his daughter. I was in a small apartment in Cape Town that I had not properly lived in for 11 years, and which still had a box of Lena's childhood drawings in the closet from when her mother had asked me to store some things during a move. 8 against, Owen said. That is not nothing. No, I said. It is not. Whatever you know, he said, I think it is time you told me. I looked out my window at the ocean. The Indian Ocean at dusk is one of the most specific things on Earth, that particular shade of deep gray blue before the light fully goes. The kind of color that makes you understand why humans spent thousands of years building mythologies around water. I had spent so much of my life in artificial light, in station corridors and pressurized chambers and recycled air, that sometimes the simple fact of an open sky still felt like something I had to adjust to. Come to Geneva, I said. There is something you need to see. He arrived 2 days later. The Geneva facility was not marked. It sat beneath a research campus that officially studied atmospheric modeling, and the people who worked in it had credentials that placed them in various universities and government science offices. None of those credentials were false, exactly. The people were real researchers. They simply also did something else. I had been inside the facility once before, 15 years ago, as part of a standard briefing for senior diplomatic staff about Earth's long-range security posture. At the time, I had come away with a general impression of preparedness, the kind of broad strategic planning that any responsible civilization maintains. I had not understood the depth of it. I do not think many people had. That was the point. The briefing room was clean and white and very quiet. 4 people were already seated when Owen and I arrived. 2 scientists whose names I will not give here, a retired admiral named Colin Marsh, who looked like someone's grandfather and had eyes like a very patient animal, and a woman in her 40s named Iris Fenn, who ran what the facility officially called its Strategic Continuity Division. Iris Fenn did not waste time with introductions. She pulled up a display and said, "We have been waiting for an authorization to proceed for 30 years. Hale's signal gave us that authorization. We want you both to understand what proceeding means before we go further." Owen looked at me. I said nothing. Iris turned to the display and began explaining the reckoning protocols. There were 3 of them. She walked through each one in a flat, clear voice, the way you explain something that has been rehearsed many times. Not because she was hiding anything behind the flatness. Because the material itself was so large that calm was the only way to move through it without losing your footing. The first protocol was called Hollow Archive. Humanity had spent 30 years embedding archivists, data specialists, and information system engineers across the Council's distributed record network. Every Council species relied on that shared network for historical reference, legal precedent, trade agreements, and diplomatic records. The network had no single point of failure because it had been designed by dozens of species across centuries. What none of those species had accounted for was the possibility of a single species quietly, methodically mapping every node, every redundancy, every backup pathway across the entire system. Humans had done this not aggressively, not as an act of hostility, in the way that humans do many things, carefully, gradually, because someone had decided it was important to understand the architecture before anything else. The people who had built this capability had started it as a defensive measure, something to protect Earth's own records from manipulation. Somewhere along the way, they had also realized they could do something more. Hollow Archive, if activated, would rewrite every record in which the Veth Dominion appeared, not delete, not corrupt, something subtler and more permanent. Every reference to Veth Dominion decisions, treaties, rulings, and historical claims would be systematically replaced with contradictions, gaps, and technical static, distributed across thousands of nodes simultaneously, in a way that would be nearly impossible to trace or reverse. The Veth would not be erased from history. They would be made unreliable. Their entire legal and historical legacy would become a thing that other species could no longer cite, trust, or build upon. The second protocol was called Thread Pull. Owen made a quiet sound when Iris described it. Over 30 years, a parallel team had mapped every dependency that the Veth Dominion maintained across the 14 species they most closely allied with. Supply chains, medical resource agreements, research partnerships, agricultural imports, biological exchange programs, infrastructure contracts. The Veth Dominion was not just politically powerful. It was woven into the practical functioning of dozens of civilizations in ways that most of those civilizations had never fully examined. They had stopped examining it because the Veth had made themselves seem permanent, the way any dominant force makes itself seem permanent, by being so consistently present that alternatives stop seeming real. Threadpull would systematically dismantle every one of those dependencies. Not through force, through redirection. Human operators, already positioned across those 14 species, would begin activating alternative supply chains, research partnerships, and resource agreements that Earth had spent years quietly establishing with smaller, overlooked species who were more than willing to step into gaps the Veth had monopolized. Each dependency would not be cut. It would be replaced, smoothly and quickly enough that the species affected would realize only in retrospect that they no longer needed the Veth for anything. The third protocol was called Witness. Iris paused before she described it. "This one is not a technical operation," she said. "This one is simply the truth. A full recording existed. Not a partial clip, not a secondhand account. A complete, unedited record of everything that had happened to Lena inside that tribunal room, captured by a monitoring system that had been installed in Concord Prime's secondary chambers 15 years ago and never detected. The recording included everything. The submission of her document, the Veth ambassador's private communication to security, the tribunal, the ruling, in every word spoken, in every language present, with full translation and context. Every legally relevant document Lena had been analyzing was attached. Every piece of evidence showing how the Veth Dominion had suppressed human advancement applications for 4 decades was formatted, verified, and indexed. The Witness broadcast would transmit this package, in full, simultaneously, to every active civilization in the known galaxy, not just the Council species. Every civilization Earth had ever made contact with, every species that listened on any frequency humanity could reach, every single one of them would receive, on the same day, at the same moment, the complete unedited record of what the Veth Dominion had done to a 19-year-old girl for asking a question. The room was silent when Iris finished. Owen sat with his hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular. Colin Marsh, the retired admiral, turned a pen slowly between his fingers and said nothing. I thought about Lena's face over her shoulder as they moved her toward the door. That expression, not fear, surprise. She had believed in the system. We were going to build a better one. But first, the one that had taken her was going to learn what it had started. Iris looked at me, Mr. Hale. The protocols are staged to run in sequence. Thread pull runs first 7 days. Hollow archive begins on day 3. Witness broadcasts on day 8. Once started, the sequence cannot be paused. She waited. Do you want to understand anything further before you confirm? No, I said. She nodded. She turned to the display and entered a single authorization code. The sequence began. Owen was quiet all the way through dinner that evening. We sat in a small restaurant near the facility, and he drank most of a bottle of wine and I drank water and outside the window. Geneva was doing what Geneva always does, existing quietly and precisely, as though nothing of consequence had ever troubled it. Finally, he said, she believed the system would work. Yes, I said. And now we are replacing the system. We are removing what was poisoning it, I said. There is a difference. He looked at me for a long time. Then he raised his glass, not as a celebration, as something else, an acknowledgement. A small private ceremony for a girl who had pressed her face against a viewport at age 7 and asked me to name every ship she could see. I raised my water glass. We did not speak again until the morning. Day 3 of the sequence brought the first visible tremor. Owen and I were back in Geneva when Iris Fenn walked into the monitoring room at 6 in the morning and set a data tablet on the table without saying anything. On it was a translated excerpt of an internal Veth Dominion communication, intercepted through a relay node that human intelligence assets had maintained access to for over a decade. The message was from a junior administrator in the Veth Historical Records Office. It was addressed to a department supervisor. It said, in very plain language, that 17 confirmed archive nodes had returned inconsistent data on Veth treaty records from the last 2 centuries, and asked whether a system error should be reported to Council Technical Services. The supervisor's response, sent 4 hours later, said that it was probably a synchronization glitch and to run a standard integrity check. Iris tapped the tablet. They think it is a technical problem, she said. Colin Marsh, who was already seated with a cup of tea, said, they will think that for approximately 2 more days. He was right. He was off by 6 hours. Owen read the intercepts over my shoulder and did not say much. He had moved from quiet acceptance to something else over the past 48 hours. Something that I recognized because I had felt it myself. Not enthusiasm, not satisfaction, a kind of steady forward-facing gravity. The feeling of something irreversible in motion. The Veth's internal technical team filed a formal error report to the Council's Data Management Authority on day 5. By that point, the inconsistencies had spread across 83 nodes. The report used careful, technical language, but beneath the language was a creeping uncertainty that even the translation could not entirely flatten. Their records were not simply glitching. They were becoming unreliable in a very specific and very troubling way. Every node that returned compromised data was returning it with perfect surface formatting, perfect timestamps, perfect structural integrity. It did not look like corruption. It looked like the records had always been that way. Which was the point? Hollow Archive was not designed to leave fingerprints. It was designed to make the Veth question their own history, slowly, in ways that looked like natural degradation rather than deliberate action. By day 6, 3 Veth-aligned species had quietly suspended the use of Veth-sourced historical records in ongoing legal proceedings, citing verification concerns. They had not been told to do this. They had done it on their own, because no careful civilization uses records they cannot fully trust. Threadpull had been moving at the same time, and its effects were quieter but perhaps more unsettling in their precision. I will try to explain what it felt like from where I was watching. Imagine a very large web, a web that a spider built over decades, attaching itself to dozens of different structures, invisible unless you were looking for it, essential to the spider's position but not obviously so to the structures themselves. Threadpull was not cutting the web, it was rerouting the structures. Each dependency the Veth had established with a partner species was being replaced, dependency by dependency, with an alternative, a new supplier here, a new research partner there, a medical resource agreement redirected to a species that had been waiting for the opportunity for years. The people running Threadpull had a name for the approach. They called it quiet doors. Every time a Veth dependency was replaced, a new door opened for another species, and that species stepped through it before they even fully understood it was there. By day 4, The Marin had quietly shifted 60% of their primary food additive import supply to a source the Veth had spent years discouraging. By day 5, 2 of the smaller species in the outer rings had signed research agreements with Earth-affiliated institutions that made their existing Veth partnerships technically redundant. By day 6, an infrastructure contract on a mid-rim station that the Veth had held for 20 years quietly transferred to a Velhari-backed firm. None of these changes were loud. None of them were announced. They simply happened, and the Veth watched them happen, and the Veth began to feel, for the first time in a very long time, something they had no cultural vocabulary for: vulnerability. It was Sovithdar himself who made the call to Earth on day 6, not through the Council's official channels, through a private diplomatic frequency that should not have been able to reach Earth directly. The fact that it did told us something useful about Veth intelligence assets, which we noted and filed for later. I was in the monitoring room when the call came in. Iris looked at me. I nodded. She routed it through a translator and let it play over the room's speakers. Sovithdar's voice was not what I expected. I had heard him speak in council sessions for over a decade, always measured, always precisely calibrated to project authority. This voice was different, not panicked, not yet. But there was something moving beneath it, something careful and controlled in the way that things are careful and controlled when the alternative is losing control entirely. He said he was reaching out as a matter of council stability. He said the current situation was creating unnecessary uncertainty across multiple species partnerships. He said Earth's silence was being interpreted in ways that were unhelpful to everyone. He said he believed a frank dialogue could resolve any outstanding concerns. He said he was prepared to discuss Lena Vasquez's case in a formal council review, with full procedural transparency. He said her name. He actually said her name. He had not said her name once in the 14 minutes of her tribunal. I looked at the speaker for a moment. Then I looked at Iris. "Is there a pre-recorded message loaded?" I asked. She nodded. "As discussed." "Play," I said. The pre-recorded message was 11 seconds long. It had been recorded in Geneva before the sequence began. Before we had any idea whether Sovithdar would ever call. Before we knew anything about how this would unfold. It had been prepared because there was always a possibility that at some point in this process, someone on the other side would reach out, and we wanted what they heard in that moment to be something we had chosen deliberately, not something improvised in the heat of a response. The voice in the recording was mine, flat, clear, completely calm. "We gave you 40 years. You gave us 40 seconds. That was all." The line disconnected. Owen was standing in the doorway of the monitoring room. He had brought 2 containers of coffee and was holding them both. He stood there for a moment after the line cut, then walked in and set 1 container in front of me. "I imagine," he said, "that did not make him feel better." "No," I agreed. Colin Marsh turned his pen slowly. "The broadcast is 40 hours out," he said. We all knew. We had all known the countdown since day 1. Everything before the witness broadcast had been preparation, positioning, the slow and systematic removal of every support structure the Veth had relied on. By the time the broadcast reached the galaxy's listening civilizations, the Veth would already be isolated, their records already compromised, their partner dependencies already redirected. The broadcast was not the weapon, it was the verdict. The truth, delivered to everyone, after everything that kept the truth inconvenient had already been quietly dismantled. Iris came in at hour 38 and told us that Veth Military Command had pinged Earth's outer relay stations with what their signal pattern indicated was a targeting request, not a strike, a threat. The thing powerful species do when they feel the ground shifting and want to remind everyone that they still have the option of force. Colin Marsh did not even look up from his tablet. "Relay defense grid is live," he said. "Has been since day 1. I had not known about the defense grid in detail. What I learned over the next 20 minutes was that Earth had spent 15 years upgrading its outer relay stations, not with offensive systems, but with something the engineers had quietly called a mirror network. Every targeting signal directed at an Earth relay station would be recognized, logged, and redirected back through the originating system as dead interference. Harmless, but precise enough that the ship which sent the targeting signal would receive it back as confirmation that the target was unreachable. Not a counterattack. A response that said, without a word, "We see you, we are not afraid of you, and your threat did not work." The Veth sent 3 more targeting pings over the next 6 hours. Each one returned as interference. On the 4th, they escalated and sent what the grid classified as a directed energy sweep toward the nearest station. The mirror network absorbed it, logged the full technical signature of the weapon, and redirected enough of the discharge back toward the originating coordinates to confirm the attempt had been detected without causing any actual damage to the Veth ship. Earth released the full log of all 4 attempts, with timestamps, weapon signatures, and coordinates, 12 hours before the witness broadcast went out. Released it not just to Council species, but to all the same distribution network the broadcast itself would use. Every species that was going to receive the story of Lena Vasquez would receive it knowing that the Veth Dominion had already tried to threaten Earth into silence. Colin Marsh looked at me after that release went out and said, very quietly, "They have made this easy for us." He did not mean it as satisfaction. He meant it the way a person means it when something they hope to avoid has been made unavoidable by someone else's choices. The countdown reached 0 at 4 a.m. Geneva time. Iris sent the broadcast command. For a moment the room was completely still. Outside the window, Geneva was dark and quiet. The stars invisible through group section of the glass were the same stars they had always been. Then Iris looked up from her console and said, "Signal confirmed on all distribution channels. Transmission is away." The witness was out. Somewhere on hundreds of worlds and stations and vessels, receivers were waking up. Translators were processing. People, creatures, minds of 100 different kinds were settling in to watch for the first time, with no filters and no council framing, the full unedited truth of what had been done to a girl named Lena Vasquez for asking a question. Owen sat back in his chair and looked up at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he said, "She would have wanted to see the look on their faces." "Yes," I said. "She would have had something specific to say about it too," he said. "Some word in some alien language that meant exactly the right thing." "Probably," I said. We sat together in the quiet of the room and waited for the galaxy to wake up. The first responses arrived within 18 hours of the broadcast, not from Council species, from the smaller civilizations, the ones far out on the edges of the network that the Council had always treated as peripheral, too distant to matter, too fragmented to be worth formal engagement. They were the first to respond, and they responded in the same way, not with outrage, not with formal diplomatic language, but with simple direct acknowledgement in their own terms. A species called the Orvasi, who communicated through color pulse sequences, sent a signal that Earth's translator team rendered as something close to, "We have heard, we have seen, we know this shape of wrong." Others followed. The Dren issued a formal statement within 24 hours which was, for the Dren, practically instantaneous. The Dren moved and spoke slowly by human standards, and their formal statements were usually weeks in the making. The fact that they had produced one in a single day told us exactly how seriously they had taken what they saw. The statement called for a full structural review of Council law regarding provisional membership, cited Lena's case by name, and formally withdrew the Dren delegation from the next 3 scheduled Council sessions. The Velhari response was more complicated. Thessa Oren, the Velhari ambassador, had always walked a careful line between her species' genuine discomfort with Veth dominance and their practical dependency on Council stability. She sent a private message to the Earth monitoring team, rather than a public statement, asking for a direct channel to whoever was running Earth's current operations. Iris looked at me. I took the call. Thessa Oren did not apologize exactly. Her species did not apologize in the way that word translates directly. But she said something that functioned as an apology. A formal acknowledgement that the Velhari delegation had not acted when they should have, that they had chosen abstention when the situation required something more, and that they wished to understand what Earth needed now. I told her what we needed. I told her clearly and without drama, because she deserved the clarity. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The accord you are proposing, the one based on individual protections regardless of species standing, we will sign it." That was the first signature. Within the exact 2 hours, 8 more species signaled their intention to support the framework. Not all of them were Council members. Some of them were species that had been watching the Council from a distance for generations, waiting for evidence that the institution could be reformed from within. The witness broadcast had answered that question in a way that years of diplomacy had not. It had shown them not just that the Council was broken, but that Earth had the will and the capability to build something better. The Veth Dominion, meanwhile, was coming apart at its foundations. The archive inconsistencies had spread far beyond what their technical teams could contain. By the time they understood that what they were dealing with was not a system error, but a deliberate, distributed rewriting operation, the damage was already too deep to reverse. Hundreds of Veth Treaty citations in active legal proceedings across the Council had been flagged as unverifiable. 3 Veth-backed judicial rulings from the past decade were suspended pending record authentication. The Veth legal team, one of the most formidable in the Council's history, found themselves in the strange and deeply uncomfortable position of being unable to prove things they knew to be true, because the records they needed to prove them were now compromised, and every species they turned to for support was quietly busy redirecting its dependencies elsewhere. I want to be precise about something here, because it matters. This was not a punishment designed to cause the Veth population to suffer. The reckoning protocols had been built around a specific targeting logic. They targeted the Veth Dominion's institutional power, its legal legacy, its political relationships, its ability to dominate other species through structural advantage. They did not target Veth citizens, Veth culture, or Veth life in any form. The people running Threadpull had spent years ensuring that every dependency being redirected was redirected in a way that left the Veth's own civilian infrastructure intact. Their food supply was unaffected. Their medical systems were unaffected. Their internal economy, which ran on completely different rails from their external dominance network, was unaffected. What was being removed was power, not people. The distinction was deliberate and it was absolute. There was a long meeting in Geneva on day 12 about what to do when Soveth Dar made a second attempt at contact. This time he used the Council's official emergency communication channel, which meant the message went formally into the diplomatic record. It was longer than the first call. He cited Council law, he cited stability arguments. He cited the welfare of other species who would be affected by Council disruption. He did not address Lina Vasquez directly, but he referenced the incident as a procedural matter that remained open to review. The room in Geneva listened to the full message. Colin Marsh said, "He is trying to reopen a negotiation that has not begun." Iris said he does not understand that what is happening is not a negotiation. Owen said nothing. He was looking at the table. I had been thinking about what to say for 2 days because I had known this call was coming. Not because I was certain Soveth Dar would make it, but because powerful things always reach out when they feel the ground shifting. They reach out because they cannot conceive of a world in which reaching out does not eventually produce a result. They have always been answered. They expect to always be answered. I thought about Lena's document. 6 weeks of work, formatted correctly, every source cited, every procedural rule followed. And the response had been a button pressed beneath a desk, and 4 officers through a side corridor. I authorized a formal response, 1 paragraph. In plain Council standard, no diplomatic softening, no procedural language. It said that Earth was not currently engaged in any diplomatic and communications regarding the Galactic Council or its members. It said that Earth was actively engaged in building a new framework for interspecies relations based on foundational protections for individuals regardless of species classification. It said that when that framework was ready, invitations to join it would be extended to species who had demonstrated they understood what it was built to protect. It said that the Veth Dominion was not currently on that invitation list. It was the most direct thing Earth's diplomatic body had ever sent through an official channel. The reaction in the Council chamber to that response, as relayed to us through Owen's contacts, was something that took me a while to fully absorb. Not chaos, not outrage. Something more complicated. Several species read it and went quiet. The Velhari ambassador read it and sent Iris Fenn a private message that said, in full, "You are going to make us all better at this." Soveth Dar read it and called a closed session of Veth-aligned species. 3 of the 14 declined to attend. Those 3 sent messages to the Earth monitoring team the following day, asking for more information about the new framework. Day 15 was when the Veth attempted their only significant show of force. I have already described the relay station targeting sequence. But what I did not describe was what happened inside the Council chamber the morning after Earth released the engagement logs. Soveth Dar walked into that session, and for the first time in 11 years of watching him operate, he looked like a man who had run out of rooms to move through. He spoke for 20 minutes. He argued that Earth had engaged in an unprecedented act of interspecies aggression. He called the archive operations an attack on Council stability. He called the Threadpull redirections economic sabotage. He called the Witness broadcast a deliberate manipulation of galactic opinion. He was not wrong about any of these characterizations in a strictly technical sense. He was entirely right about what had been done. He was simply speaking to a chamber that had already watched the broadcast. They had seen the tribunal room. They had seen Lina Vasquez's document. They had seen the suppressed advancement applications. They had seen what the Veth Dominion had called a procedural enforcement action. And they had seen what Earth had built in response. Not in the heat of grief, but over 30 quiet years, patient and precise. When Soveth Dar finished speaking, Thessa Oren stood up. This was unusual. The Velhari ambassador was not an emotional speaker. She was precise and formal and built her arguments slowly. But she stood up immediately when he finished, and she spoke in a voice that was quieter than usual, which in Velhari terms meant it was more serious. She said that the chamber had heard the Veth Dominion describe what had been done to it. She asked the chamber to also consider what the Veth Dominion had done first. She asked the chamber to consider whether any of them, in Earth's position, would have acted differently. She asked the chamber to consider what it said about them that it had taken this much for them to act. She sat down. The session produced no resolutions, no votes were called. Something changed in that room and everyone in it could feel it. The axis had shifted. The thing that the Veth Dominion had built over centuries, the assumption that their position was simply a fact of the galaxy, like gravity or light, had been demonstrated to be a thing that could be taken apart. By day 18, 5 more species had withdrawn formal recognition of the Veth Dominion's legal authority within their territories, not a declaration of hostility, simply an administrative reclassification, processed quietly, the way you update a record when the information in it is no longer accurate. Owen came to find me on day 19. I was in the monitoring room, reading through the latest reports. He sat down and was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The Accord of Witnesses, they are calling it that." "Did you name it?" Isa said. Thessa Oren named it. She said it should be named for the act of seeing and not looking away. He nodded. Lena would have loved that. "Yes," I said. He looked at the reports on my screen for a moment. "How many signatures now?" 11 confirmed, 4 pending. 2 requesting clarification on specific clauses, which means they are going to sign once we work through the language. "And the Veth?" I was quiet for a moment. "They are still there," I said. "They will be there for a long time. We did not end them. We could not end them, and we never intended to. But they are not what they were. They will not be what they were again." He thought about that. Then he said, "Is that enough?" It was the question I had been asking myself for 19 days. Every morning since Iris Fenn had entered the authorization code and the sequence had begun, I had been turning it over. Enough for what? Enough for justice. Enough for Lena. Enough for all the other species that the Veth Dominion had pressed down and managed and condescended to across its centuries of dominance. I did not have a clean answer. I do not think clean answers exist for questions that size. It is what was possible, I said. And it is honest, we did not do what they did to her. We did not take something away that should have been allowed to live. We took away the structure that let them take things away. That is a different thing. Owen looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded and looked back at the reports and did not say anything more. Outside, Geneva was bright and cold. The sky was the particular white-blue of high-altitude winter, and the light through the windows was sharp and clean. It was the kind of day that looks like clarity, the kind that makes you feel, without quite being able to explain it, that something has been settled. The signing of the Accord of Witnesses took place in Geneva, not on Concord Prime, not in some neutral station chosen for its symbolic distance from any single species. On Earth, in the city that had housed humanity's diplomatic institutions since before we ever looked at the stars and imagined ourselves among them. On the same continent where, a few centuries ago, people had sat down after great conflicts and tried to write rules for how to treat each other. Rules that had held imperfectly and been revised and had held again, because that is how civilization works. You write the rules, you find the gaps, you close them, and you try again. Thessa Oren arrived first. She came through the main entrance of the Geneva Convention Hall with her delegation, all of them in the soft pale gray formal dress of the Velhari, and she stopped at the top of the steps and looked out at the city for a moment before going inside. I was standing near the entrance, and I watched her look at it. I did not know what she was thinking, but I thought she was doing what I had done many times, adjusting to the fact of an open sky. Owen and I arrived together. He was wearing the same jacket he had worn on Concord Prime the day we left, which I noticed but did not say anything about. He had a small photograph in his breast pocket, which I also noticed. I had seen it once before, in his Bristol flat. It was Lena at age 15, standing in front of a star map she had drawn herself, pointing at something just off the frame. The signing hall was full, not just with the confirmed signatories, but with delegations from species that had sent observers, that were watching to understand what this thing was before they decided whether they wanted to be part of it. Colin Marsh was there, in civilian clothes, sitting near the back. He gave me a small nod when I came in. Iris Fenn was seated at the technical table near the side wall, running the translation feeds. She had barely slept in the past week, and she looked like someone who had spent that time doing exactly the thing they were meant to do. The preamble of the accord was read aloud by a Vilhari legal scholar named Oris, who had drafted the final language in collaboration with an Earth jurist, Caroline Webb, and a Dren legal theorist whose name translated approximately as still water. The preamble was not long. It did not need to be long. It opened with a sentence that Caroline and Oris had argued about for 4 days and had eventually settled on together. Somewhere in the early hours of a Geneva morning, over a very cold table and a translation console that kept losing the Dren dialect. I will not quote it here in full, but it began by stating that no civilization that calls itself civilized may claim jurisdiction over the life of a being from another species, without the full knowledge and consent of that species, and that this principle has no exceptions, no matter the legal tradition of the entity invoking it. The name in the preamble was Lena Vasquez. Her full name, her species, her age, her role on Concord Prime, and the date she died, not as a tragedy, as a precedent. The preamble stated plainly that the accord existed because of her, not in her memory but in her logic. Because she had been right. The system should work if you work it right. And the accord was the system she had been trying to reach. I was asked to be the first to sign on behalf of Earth. I do not know who made that decision. Possibly Iris. Possibly Caroline, it does not matter. I walked to the table and I picked up the stylus, and I looked at the page for a moment before I signed. Thessa Oren signed for the Vilhari. The Dren representative signed in their way, a formal impression of their seal pressed into a specially prepared surface. 11 other species signed before the session ended. 4 more sent formal ratification transmissions within the following week. After the signing, people moved around the hall in that particular way of formal events, carefully, with refreshments, with the low-level hum of many simultaneous conversations in many languages. I stood near the window for a while. The window faced east, and the afternoon light was coming in at a low angle, the kind of light that makes ordinary rooms look significant. Owen found me there. He stood beside me and we both looked at the light for a while. I have been thinking, he said, about something she said to me once. She was about 16, I think. She had just had some argument with one of her professors about the council's founding charter. And she was still lit up about it, the way she got when she was working through something. She said to me, "Owen, the problem with the charter is that it was written by species who were thinking about themselves. Nobody wrote it thinking about the person in the room who does not have a seat at the table yet." He stopped. "She said that at 16, I said. "She was always a few steps ahead," he said, "of everyone." I thought about that. I thought about the preamble I had just signed, about the principle it established. The idea that the person in the room without a seat at the table was precisely the person the rules needed to be written for. I thought about how it had taken a death to get that idea into a formal document. I thought about how many ideas like it have required exactly that, across all of human history and apparently across galactic history too. The things that should have been obvious from the beginning, that people resist and delay and proceduralize away until something breaks, and the cost becomes too high to ignore. I did not think this was a reason to despair. I thought it was a reason to be very specific about what you build next. The Veth Dominion had not signed the accord. They had sent no observer delegation. Their seat in the convention hall was empty, which several journalists photographed, and which I had not arranged but did not try to prevent. I did not feel triumph about the empty seat. I did not feel much of anything about it, which I had to be honest with myself about, because I had expected to feel more. What I felt when I looked at it was something more like completion, not satisfaction, not resolution in the warm sense, but the particular feeling of a process that has been carried through to its end correctly, every step accounted for, nothing left undone. The Veth Dominion still existed. Their people still lived their lives on their worlds, eating and working and arguing and hoping, the way all people do. Their government still functioned, though it had lost formal recognition in significant parts of the galaxy. Their leaders were still in place, still making decisions, but their decisions now had a smaller radius. The things they had once been able to do, suppress applications, manipulate records, press down a species for 40 years without consequence, those things were no longer available to them, not because they had been punished, because the conditions that had made those things possible had been removed. I had been asked in the weeks leading up to the signing by several species representatives whether Earth intended to pursue any further action against the Veth Dominion beyond what had already occurred. I had given the same answer each time. Earth was not pursuing action against the Veth Dominion. Earth was no longer focused on the Veth Dominion. Earth was focused on building the Accord, on working with the new signatories, on developing the institutional structure that would make the Accord functional and enforceable. The Veth Dominion was a closed chapter in a book that had many more pages to write. That was true. I also believed it. And I also knew that if the Veth Dominion ever again took a deliberate action against an individual from another species under the cover of procedural authority, the Accord would have something to say about it, and Earth would be part of that conversation. The rules had changed. They had changed for everyone, including for whoever decided to test them. That evening, after the hall had cleared and the delegations had returned to their accommodations, I went back alone to the signing room. The lights were lower. Someone had tidied the tables. The document was in its archive housing. I did not open it. I stood in the quiet room and I thought about Concord Prime and a 19-year-old girl pressing her face against a viewport. I thought about the star map she had drawn at 15. I thought about the 6 weeks she had spent on a document she had believed would be received as what it was. Careful, honest, correct. She had been right about that, in the end. The document had been received correctly. It had taken a few more steps than she had planned for, but the argument she had made, that the truth was there and could be found and mattered, that argument had held. I put my hand flat on the table where I had signed and I stayed there for a while in the quiet, and I let myself finally be still. Outside, Geneva was moving into evening. The sky was going from pale blue to something deeper, the color that comes just before the first stars appear. I stood at the window and I waited for them. When the first one came through, small and clear and certain, I thought of her. They thought taking her would teach us our place. It did. It taught us that our place is wherever we decide it is, and that some things, once broken, we will spend the rest of our civilization making sure never break again. Not out of anger, not out of grief, out of the absolute, steady, forward-facing knowledge that she was right, and that being right deserves to matter, and that if it does not matter yet, then you build the world in which it does. That is what we built. That is what her name is written into. That is what she always was. Not just a girl with a datapad and a question, but the beginning of an answer